especially your art practice, how can your practice be able to play a role in forging community cohesion, yourself as an artist?
Yes, I think for starters, one has to understand that even local content is part of promoting that and building that bridge between your world, which you are in, and the outside, those who come in from the other side. And through your practice already here locally where you are, it creates that link and a window for people to see how you are or what kind of a society you come from.
As an artist, we have taken part in a number of international exhibitions, both locally and internationally, and in particular, the Venice Biennale, where you were one of the artists. What role do you think your work played in terms of cohesion within the international community in Venice?
It's actually interesting because you discover that, like when you practice here, you are telling your own legal story from your own environment and geography. And then you move to another platform where all of a sudden what you are talking about here has relevance to the people out there, which is never expected. At this first place, you are thinking maybe this is just our story here. You are just telling your own story here. But it has a lot of relevance as you move beyond your own geography. And my experience was more an idea where, how does this make sense to somebody who doesn't exist in the same space as I am, as the creator of the work? But that is the interesting part about diversity. You will never know the translation of what you do in your own environment to the other. And I found it was a learning process for me, where you start having deeper thoughts about your own environment, about your own situation, because we are all in this together. It might be a local idea, it might be a local thought, but it has a global resonance, because this is the interesting part about humanity.
Looking back in your life in the diaspora, what can you say about your experience in Germany in terms of diversity? How diverse was the German community? And also within your own practice, whether you were allowed as an artist who is coming from outside to be able to stand at par with other artists within the German community?
Well, it was a different time. I think one has to understand and appreciate that time in between, because back then it was different to maybe now. And for me, the time when I was living there and practicing even there, I got basically to learn more about Africa out there than here. I got to understand where I'm from when I was out there than when I'm here, when you are within. And I guess it has something to do with when you move out of your comfort zone. You start looking at life a bit different. And the whole idea of exchange, I worked in a lot of projects where we had different artists coming from other parts of the world. We had artists from Latin America, you had the European artists, and then basically just sharing the ideas or looking into, production of collaborative work. It just makes you realize we are not far apart as people. We are not that different. And I think the current times shows us that the most.
You talked about the time between. What time between when you lived in Germany? Can you give us a context of when you worked in Germany and how Germany was at that time when you were still in Germany?
Of course, it's an open society. It's there is that open policy, where you are welcomed with open arms. This is the entry point into their society. You enter, you become part and parcel as long as you still function within their cultural realm. But then you come yourself as somebody who comes from a different culture. So how do you merge those two scenarios? So for me, I started learning how to look at the other, appreciate the otherness. You might not have everything according to your own way or what you are used to, but then you are forced in that situation to revisit and relook at what you think you know. But then in general, this is a very open society where they are keen to learn from you. But then that's a position in which you are not used to. It starts, this is how I always try to put it. The change, I'm talking of the first time really landing into that country. The change happens overnight. You fly from this end of the world, and then the next morning you are there. That change happens in a sort of darkness. It's a quick change. Then from there, you have to start navigating with what is in front of you. And there's a lot you learn about yourself in that second, because nothing is common. You have never seen this before. And there you start having this kind of understanding, like, oh, okay, this is how they do it. And then you learn to adjust accordingly.
So can you say art brings people together?
Yes, in a way. In a way, art does bring us together because you see, we have, instead of just having a dry conversation where it's face on, art gives us another middle ground where we can have something to talk about. We break ground. And then art works like that. It's a connection, which makes us have an easier conversation as a people. By using art, it can be something you have done and somebody approaches you who would have never approached you before. But because you are producing something, you are presenting something, somebody will have a way of communicating, but then art becomes the catalyst, I would say.
Then, I mean, after years out there in Germany, you returned back into Zimbabwe. How did you fit into the community where you had left for a long time? And as an artist, how were you received by your other fellow artists in Zimbabwe? Was it easy for you to get back into the system, or it was difficult?
See, the question is what system? You see, the problem is when you leave call it a village. You move somewhere, you are not the same.
Yeah.
When you come back, you are not the same. It's what are you returning to at the end? Something has happened. You have gone through a process. When you come back, you are not just you. It's versions of who you are, which return. And then the difficult part is mostly for your colleagues and friends. They never maybe saw the change or the process, how you went through the whole time of being not home. But then when you return, they have the same image of you before, your previous image before you left. So now you are back. It's supposedly something where you have to just resume, but it's impossible. Something has happened to you. You have seen something, and it's a legal glitch because it starts with conversating on different things because you have seen something different. It becomes difficult for some to understand what you are talking about. And I think this is, it's in relation to, I think even explorers have the same, you know, you go out there, you discover something new, if it's new, something different, and then you come back. How do you tell the story? This is for the time of social media where where you can post every moment, every day. Back then, it was either you wrote a letter or you take images, and sometimes, you know, you freeze a moment. It's not the same, you know. So it's a different time, and at the end, you return, but with all these experiences. And sometimes it's very difficult for your colleagues and friends to relate because they were not there.
Okay. Looking at your work, The Urban Hustlers, which I found very, very interesting, and the scale or in which you work. Why, I mean, you've got this huge, big scale compared to a number of artists that I've known, and especially that body of work, the Urban Hustlers. Can you take us through that body of work and what really inspires the Urban Hustlers?
Right. I'm basically interested in the urban landscape, men and women in the, you know, everyday men and women on the streets. My idea is more to think, you know, when you are in an urban space, you are trying to survive most of the time. You know, city space is always seen as corporate or a space where you can forge a living from. But then I always find it interesting how we forge our lives around urban spaces. We use in order to forge a life. Especially for some of us who come from this kind of geography where, you know, Zimbabweans, we are like entrepreneurs. We don't really, we don't really have much of that formal part in our existence in urban spaces. So that interests me. What do you do? Everybody, when they come into the city, there is something they are trying to get out, but then they forge a new character of themselves, how they exist within that urban space. Now, these characters, they have a certain trait or a way of existing, the way they talk, the way they walk, the way they interact with the space. And that is what interests me in the work, where I find those hustlers, it's you take what is there and remodel it to suit your circumstance. And that is what is interesting for me. And these guys, they are not your usual guy you will meet in a formal office. These are street guys who don't exist in that same realm, but they find their own ways, even if it's, you find maybe a hat hustler. This guy is specialized just on selling hats, but it's not the idea of selling hats. It's inhabiting in a space where it's unconventional and then create a kind of a life. And there is where my focus usually becomes. And again, at the other hand, it's more, you're shedding light into the invisible. We don't see these guys. We see them, but we don't actually recognize them most of the time. But these are the amazing artists in urban spaces. We find them everywhere in the world. When you are in New York, you have the big jacket guy with all the merchandise in him. So that's the whole idea. I'm interested in that idea of you come into a space, forge your own existence within that space.
Okay, given that the urban landscape of most cities, that includes Bulawayo, Harare, Gweru, Kwekwe, Nairobi, Lagos, and many other cities, with this COVID-19, and I'm sure here in Harare, most of those urban hustlers who are hustling in Mbare, in other spaces, most of their stations have now been destroyed.
Yes.
Is this going to bring a new work out of what you normally do with the urban hustlers, given that there will be a new lease of life altogether? Because lapana komhlahlandlela, lapana edorobheni, lapana Kotamai boutique, it's no longer there.
Yes, that's the interesting part. How does the new urban landscape look?
Yes.
This is where it starts to be interesting already. How will it look? How does it affect those who inhabit within it? And even my work will go along that. Remember, it's not about where they are in the physical space to say it's that space. No, it's the idea of hustling. It's the idea of forging life. Even already now, with this pandemic, which is here, you have to find a new way. You, me, everybody has to find a new way of existing in that urban space, even if it means you are walking around with your mask or I don't know whatever measure which will be put, it will change. And the work still evolves in that existence of how maybe, and again, it's more a time capsule again. You can tell from the work, oh, this is within that time. This is the time when the pandemic was there. This is post-pandemic. So it's not looking at just them as something which is in one position. It keeps changing. The hustlers keep changing. It always changes. I will look a bit back. Let's say we had a situation where people used to be selling tomatoes on the streets. Like in urban spaces, it used to be women before. You can agree with me there or maybe disagree. But then later, when the situation in the country changed, you would find unusual people selling too, where you're like, oh, wait a minute, is this a hustler or not? And again, it speaks a lot into our human condition, what we deem as who we are is never permanent. It keeps changing.
The constant changes.
It just changes depending on what condition you find yourself in. Look at us now. I mean, we are connecting virtually.
Yeah.
You know, and that is the idea. That's where the whole concept comes from. I'm curious too. The post-corona scenario. I don't know how it's going to look.
Well, I mean, we are all, it's a wait and see situation. I know that museums across the Europe and Asia, they are now opening with strict conditions. And we are also waiting for a moment when we are going to officially open as a gallery. Lapana e Harare, and Konapa e Bulawayo, and in Mutare. But we're also looking at how we're going to deal with our audience as they come in, how we're going to deal with exhibition openings. And because the exhibitions are not going to be the same as much as we're going to put them online, but seeing the real art in the real scale, it's something unique. And it's actually something which is going to be very, very special for the audience, as much as they would have visited the exhibition online, but coming into the gallery, looking at the Charles Bhebhe's urban hustlers in real life is something which is going to inspire or be a healing tool to a number of people whose mental health is actually suffering as we are in lockdown throughout the world. But I want us to, since you are in your studio, it will be very, very interesting because I can look at just behind you that there are some huge paintings that I'm looking at. And it will be interesting just for a small snippet of that to our listeners.
Yeah, well, it's not ready yet. But coming back to your point of how does it look after, with the whole idea of partial opening museums and galleries and all these public spaces. I mean, for me, the interesting part is when will it, how can I put it? I think it's more a collective decision to see if that can maybe work. Because remember, our normal is gone.
Yes.
The normalcy, which we know is no longer here. And then now, how do we do this? It's for how long? That's the question. But then for me, I'm interested in the whole idea of the value of that direct contact, or the value of looking at the work or looking at my work physically. You see, this new direction gives us another window, another opportunity where, I mean, there are some galleries which exist virtually. How still people do enjoy, you know, the work and interact with the work. We are connected worldwide, not physically. It's already like this. And I think this reality, what we are talking about, we are already in it. It's through the post we share, it's through the postings, the writings of the wall, which we do even through social media. We are already there.
Well, I'm just looking at questions here because we have got Saziso, who's actually sent a very, very interesting question, which would you be interested in exploring the identity of the urban hustler in a global context?
Yes, definitely. I had one project which I had an idea to do, because I know Saziso, most probably she's in London. And I was interested in the idea of language as identity, where somebody enters a new landscape and they create their own language as an identity. You know, I think one has that. I mean, we have seen this with creolization of languages, where you forge a new language from what is there, using bits and pieces from there, which is the same way how a hustler would do that. And I was interested in understanding that, like, what identity means when you change your environment and find yourself in a new setup. What will be your identity? How does it look? Would it make sense to what you are used to? And that's a very interesting thing to look into. And definitely, I am keen on such kind of work, and I will be interested in finding out how that looks, because most of my work looks at here where I am in my own geography. How does it look when I'm in Moscow? Definitely they are.
And how does it look with the Venice Senegalese bestsellers?
Yes, yes. Those were the other hustlers even, you know. They found their way to forge their way into that new environment. And it's an interesting concept. And I take the challenge.
Fantastic. Then I've got a question from Buto, who is our regional director in Bulawayo, the National Gallery. What does the expression common man mean to you in light of your focus on urban hustlers?
Right. Common man, that's a very good question. You see, we are all men in one way. But then the common men I'm talking about, these are the individuals who live on the edges of society, who are, we don't really consider them as part of that urban landscape usually, because there's not much of a contribution which comes from them. So for me, that's the interest which I have, where I say those are the people who interest my practice. It's that idea of trying to have them visualize themselves. They go through, or let's say they pass a museum, they see themselves. It's like I said before, it's shedding light into the darker spots of urban landscapes. But
I would like to look back at an exhibition which was there at the National Gallery in Bulawayo, which was done by the late director, my sister Yvonne Vera, Tati Bicycle.
Yes.
And Tata Camera.
Yes.
Whereby people donated some of their photographs and be able to come and see themselves. Would you be in a position of thinking along those lines, that your hustlers, to get them into the gallery to come and see themselves?
Well, for now, you are the director, and is that something which a gallery can accept? Because it can look very messy sometimes, you know. Because the people I'm talking about here, we see these people, but we don't really recognize them. It's
are they anonymous?
It's not easy to, because even looking at a museum or a formal setup of an institution, you know, you wouldn't want to have an urban hustler working in
Why
that
not?
space.
Why not if not? Why not?
But these are the new possibilities we are talking about, where we have to forge new ways of looking at how we work or how we proceed. And
because
for me,
why I'm saying this, because it is very important. I want to look back into the conversation we had with ICOM UK on Monday, which is how can museums respond to diversity in COVID-19 and beyond? Because if you are talking about diversity in the UK, the accessibility of the people of color in museum structures is very limited. But if you come back here at home, there are those who were previously disadvantaged. You know, museums were a privilege of few. But how can we reach out to those hustlers and try to, it doesn't matter. I'm sure as museums, we need to open our doors now. I mean,
I think yes, sorry to interrupt. I think it's for me, it's a win, because look at us now. We are talking of urban hustlers on such a platform. I mean, in an ordinary time, we won't be talking about such people or such lives. And it starts with that small idea, and then it expands to ideas of what you are talking about, like let's open it up for them. But then even institutions have to be willing to take, because these are my elements of my narratives. If I have to bring them into those institutions, the institution has to be open even to let them in.
I would say, why not if not? And before you come back, I would like you to, there's a question from Olga, which says, I feel it is a good idea to invite those invisible to society to place where they can be seen and recognized. From my experience, yes, it can be messy, but it is also what museums should be about. What do you think?
Yes, thank you, Olga. I think Olga is somewhere in Cape Town, I'm sure, or somewhere in, I think she's in Cape Town.
And she goes on to say, to make invisible visible, to recover narratives that have been marginalized and marginalized.
Yes, this is the idea of my paintings. This is the idea of showing them. And as part of the whole process is really shedding light into what we normally don't see. It's a very good idea. And I would love to really engage and have that kind of association and bring it to the museums, and then so that we see them. It should make us uncomfortable. It shouldn't just only exist on my paintings. These are people I interact with. These are the men and women from the streets. I speak to them. You see, you visualize who they are. And we can bring them in. And again, presumably that the institutions open their doors too.
Well, the institutions, I mean, the issue of diversity and the issue of museum being accessible to all is one of the key important things that us as cultural workers, we must not forget. But at the same time, I would like to go back to some of our listeners. Tapiwa Chiwota from Cape Town is saying, I think it is very empowering to bring your source of inspiration or subject to the museum. The positivity that comes with that will change their lives.
And it will change even our perspectives, our perspective on how we look at them. That's the most important part, even. For me, this is a win, because this discussion was never even thought of. It was never there. We had these discussions before, where how do we open up the spaces? How do we open up our institutions to everybody? They were part of ideas or questions before, where we were talking of how do we engage local consumption of our art? how can local people consume what we do when we don't open doors to them? And this is where the part comes in.
This is where the hustler is coming in.
Yes, when they come, they feel like they are part of that society.
Yes.
And what kind of a society will we be where we cannot show face of some of our, our members?
Mm.
That's where it is, because they don't bring. Is it because they don't bring any financial?
Okay, I would like to read another question, which is coming from Fadzai Muchengwa, who says,
Yes.
I think sometimes we speak from positions of privilege and think that certain narratives make gallery space messy. It is important for us to start thinking of galleries, museums as for everyone. We should not keep anyone out.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you for that, Fadzi. Yes, and I'm glad, because part of our executive is here. They are watching, they are listening. And I think it's points to be taken. And as I've put it already before, this discussion won't be there if I never shined a bit of light into it. Today we are talking urban hustlers. It wasn't there before. And for me, it's one step, and then comes the second part, which is maybe engaging, coming into those spaces. You have to knit, the subjects with the institutions so that it makes sense even for us who are privileged to recognize that there are others. That's the whole diversity part of it.
Well, this is very, very interesting. And I think it's also challenging those who are working in these institutions and all of us as cultural workers. But it's like having known you for some time, for a long time, and coming into studio almost every time when I come to Bulawayo, I make it a point that I spend time in your studio, and the processes of how you come out into those huge works, which I think they are powerful. They made a very big impact in many exhibitions. I was talking to a gallery in China who was able to see some of the work in China at the Biennale, and they were very, very curious. I also wanted to know more about the processes of how you come out with those images.
Right. Thanks to the digital age, unlike before, previously you used to go around, make sketches, and have a big sketchbook. I have those from the earlier years. Thanks to the digital age, you are having a camera all the time, and it's not just photographing people. It's really more interacting with the people, talk to the subject. For example, this piece on the background here, these hustlers, they are more, they work, they clean cars in town. It's a car wash. It's a collective car wash guys. These are young guys who they come every day into town. They wash cars from people. And these boys, they don't steal, they don't do anything to anybody. Their job, they fend for themselves. They are not formally employed at anybody, but they found a way of using their skill. But it's not about just these boys cleaning the cars. You have to understand these characters, who these boys are, where they come from, the conversation you have with these boys when you get your car clean. That's what is interesting for me. It's how can I put it? It's how they relate to you, even though they are not on the same privilege space as you are.
Mm-hmm.
But they can find a way of relating into deeper issues in life, current affairs, things which are happening in society. They relate. They know what is going on. So it's, and then for me, that's the idea of a hustler. You know, you find a way to forge survival in unconventional ways.
I want us to go back to the dollar piece.
Yes.
Can you, because that piece to me really touched me, and I don't know whether you have an image there which we can show some of the audience to get an understanding of what we're talking about.
Right. The Zim dollar. Maybe I should start by explaining, let's say, my process. I usually begin with I begin from a dark background.
Yes, yeah.
I try to look for the light. And again, it makes sense with the idea of doing the hustlers, showing, shedding light into who they are and try to put them up there. So I begin from the dark going to the light.
Mm-hmm.
The dark canvas or the black canvas represents, it becomes even a metaphor. You want to bring something out from the darkness. And that's the same thing which I did with the dollar, the Zim dollar. The Zim dollar is actually not a Zim dollar, as for those who know the piece. It's actually an American dollar.
Which has become
which became a Zim dollar. But then, when you look at the piece, it's not a clear American dollar. It becomes a symbol of, you know, it actually comes from the dirty dollar. Like, you know, the dollars which we found, there was a time where whenever you went to a shop, you are given a $1 note, and it's so bad that sometimes it's even difficult to put it in a wallet without the dollar breaking apart. Now, I try to use that and that idea of decay of something which is valuable or intended to be valuable, but it's going through the idea of decay, or it's going through the process of decay, and then repurpose that to represent monetary value for a nation. And that's where I started now to really shed light into that, because that Zim dollar, which is not a Zim dollar, is in a state of decay. It's emerging on this dark background. It supposedly should represent, you know, a sense of stability. But then it's interesting to search for stability in something which is going through a process of decay. So that's where the piece was looking into. And I think most of us in Zimbabwe, we know the things we went through with our whole economic situation in the country, the whole, you know, devaluation of our own currency, and adaptation of hybrid currencies, especially the dollarization of our economy. And I tried to really more question and highlight at the same time the idea of using a symbol of stability when there is decay at the same level.
Yes, we've got another question from Mary V. Johnson. I think
Right.
an interesting question is who the artist imagines as their audience and whether or not it differs from that of the gallery.
Very good. That's a very good contribution towards that. And I think for us as art practitioners and let's say for the institution executives, it's a question to us all to rethink how we are to envision the future of how we can coexist with the ideas, because especially for some of us who are highlighting something which you can encounter, something which exists already on another level in our society. How do we engage that? How do we incorporate that into our so-called new norm?
But at the same time, I've got another contribution from Charles Nkomo, who is actually commenting and saying, I think it's a good idea to bring them in the museum or galleries. It expresses the reality of their life. That's a comment from Charles Nkomo, which I also think that, I mean, as museum professionals, because like I highlighted earlier on talking about the previously disadvantaged communities, that these museums, even for me, yes, it's a privilege working at the gallery because these were no-go areas. But how do we bring those people into the gallery? And I'm sure that can also be part of an educational tool to bring the people from the townships into the gallery and for them to understand that galleries are there for us.
And on that point again, it will answer some of our question when it comes to how do we bring art into our society, because you know we exist in a very unique scenario where institutions have been created through the whole colonial inheritance. How do we change those structures post? Because we are talking 40 years after independence. Are we still keeping the same pillars as of before, or we have a chance of recreating our own understanding, our own way of functioning? Because there is the question of sustenance. How do we sustain these institutions? And I think we might be surprised about our own society, how much they can respond to that. It's not just one narrative of who we are, it's a multiplicity of who we are, which creates our society. There is a middle class even. It's not just us disadvantaged. There is others because they have never maybe experienced or seen. I know the gallery had programs of bringing maybe corporate into the gallery spaces. But then here, what we are talking about is bigger than corporate, it's bigger than just sustenance of an institution, is really changing the way how we can move forward in the future and incorporate our own people. And then maybe on the next generations, we will have what we have always deemed as a disadvantage for our people, that they cannot afford to come into these spaces. It can change.
Well, we have another contributor here, Jubilee, who says, it is always great to have new audience in galleries and museums, as to not associate these institutions only for the certain groups of people, e.g. academics, art followers, galleries and museums are constantly in search for new audience. And I would also want to go another comment, which is, this is a question, which is coming from Jocelyn Jacobson, who says, the word privilege can become confusing. Do you mean that privilege as having money? Once in Zimbabwe, privilege was with white people, regardless if they had money or not. How does this come about in Zimbabwe? For instance, are artists with a studio in a gallery more privileged than the others, even if they have not earning much money? Is privilege now about what one earns or has in a bank balance, or privilege, or is privilege diversity and openness?
Very good question. Thank you there, Joylin. I think why we are on this at this moment or in this juncture, it's because of the work I do, the people I portray in my work. These are not your ordinary people you just meet in an institution. These are men and women of the streets. And by privilege, including myself, means it's all about, it's easier to have, like the comment before, to have those who are literate and all those layers we were talking about before. But what we are talking about, how far do we open spaces to have that diversity of everyone, regardless of their status, whether it's money, whether it's having a studio in or outside the institution. The idea of inclusiveness. But that's what we were talking about, that what we have seen so far, it has created conflict in between. So how do we open those barriers now that we are talking about them? Now we recognize them, now we acknowledge them, they are there, we see them. Now how do we bring them in? And this is the part where the museums are to work towards, without really going into detail about sustenance.
Wow. Then Olga comes back and say, perhaps privilege is also associated with cultural capacity, which may not explicitly monetary, is still capital and divides societies into those who have it and those who do not have.
Yes, I think the function of opening up in our geography is to, it's more a learning tool. We are teaching our people to be inclusive in that. It's not just only for the elite. If we have our urban hustlers in museums, it will make them belonging. It's a double standard. Those privileged will see them, not just from the paintings, but physical. Okay, maybe now it's a bit difficult physical, but they are part of that fraternity at the end. And I know that other museums, they have special days. Let's say, I think the museum in Cape Town, they open up certain days that the general public can access the museum and learn. And there are other cultural institutions where they have schools coming into the museums and all these spaces. But then those are organized happenings. We are talking about the general public. And I am taking the challenge to bring them in and see how it looks. I do take that challenge.
I'm sure this is the National Gallery of Zimbabwe. We have what we call free Sundays. The free Sundays for all citizens of Zimbabwe, they are free to walk in the National Gallery to visit exhibitions. But this is also part and parcel of a project whereby we would like our people to understand that these museums are not only for white people, because there's been a tendency that museums and the galleries are only for white people. So we need to be able to bridge that gap. But to bridge that gap, it's a journey we have to go through. It's a journey that we have to take, but artists have a role to play in that journey as they bring their work into exhibitions.
Yes. And again, for me to bring joy to see, I mean, I'm constant in connection with my subjects. And it will be amazing for them to really visit themselves in these institutions, in these museums. It's to visualize yourself. I think on other international museums, we are still on the question of go to a museum to meet yourself. And usually you go in some of these museums, you don't see people of color in that sense. But that's another discussion for another day. On our context here, and to me, it's more the, I think Kreshmia was, on your last conversation, she was saying it's because of there is no market for us as local artists here. No, we can build that. And it starts with such ideas. It might take longer, but maybe it will reap benefits for our own children or our grandchildren at the end. And somebody has to begin to think beyond what is there. And this is one of the things which we are taking as we move forward as a society, that we need to think and act and try new ways of thinking which have diversity and inclusion.
Okay. Yes. Yeah, you can go ahead. You can go ahead.
Yes, because at the end of the day, we are telling stories from our own society. And our own people are not the consumers of our own stories.
I'm sure that was actually brought into a discussion the other previous discussions, that we need to be able to, for our own people to hear these stories, because we always make these stories for the people outside. And I would like to, we need to wrap up, because I mean, we're running out of time, but I would also want to say, Tapiwa from Cape Town, Tapiwa Chiwota says, but also what we are doing to nudge the Zimbabwean society to visit galleries must be a place of cultural inspiration, a source of identity. I think we need to run a behavioral change campaign to make people understand and appreciate art.
Yes, and I think the first step is really opening the doors and then having more and more, because again, when you talk of culture, it depends where you start, because today culture looks a bit different than what maybe we were used to be or we were taught. And the new culture will be forged by you and me and everybody else who is in this society.
Well, before we wrap up, what does your mom think about your work?
Oh yes, dear mama, yes. Yes. What does my mother think? Good question. I've never
Yes,
actually
because I
asked.
mean, we are talking about other people, but I want to
Yeah.
bring it closer to home.
Yes, closer to home.
Does she, has she
Good
visited
question.
you? Has she come to your studio? And if she has, what does she
Yeah,
feel about
definitely. I think sometimes it's a bit difficult because one, they don't understand usually what you are doing there. Sometimes it's about the benefits. It's about the benefits of, they know they can always find me in the studio. It's very interesting. I mean, it's that silent note where you see, okay, what is it? Will she say something or not? But then later there is no comment, but she's looking. She's definitely looking. And I've never asked. That's a very good question. I think next time.
Has she attended one of your exhibitions in Bulawayo?
No, because we are living in different towns. You know, she has she doesn't live here in Bulawayo.
Well, I mean, this is what I think we also need to think about as we do exhibitions. Sometimes artists to be able to bring the family members for them to be able to understand. I remember very well that when I started working as a curator, I used to bring my father to a number of exhibitions I used to curate during Haifa. And my father was a World War II veteran who fought in Burma. And for him, he was very much interested in looking at what artists are doing, but also it is that free glass of wine, which, it was something which was very, very special to him, because sometimes when they used to have rum, I would make sure that at least there's rum, because he used to love rum, what he was drinking in Burma. So I think there is a need for us to take another step to be able to bring our family members so much that they can understand as much as we can bring the hustlers.
Yes, and I think for me, it's more my children. My children they are my fans. They support, they come to my studio. Sometimes they critique my work. We constantly talk about what I do, especially, the ideas I have. Sometimes before even the works begin, the line of thought I share with my children. And I think that's maybe the part where it's a bit distant, let's say, to my mother, because I already have a family and they are grown up. So yes, I know. I don't look like that, but it is how it is. I have a very good relationship to my children, and they are part of every step I take or do, whether studio-wise and beyond.
Fantastic. Anyway, I'm sure we are getting closer to the end, and I would like to ask our viewers, anyone who has got a question to Charles Bhebhe, so that at least we can wrap up our conversation. But there is a comment from Frida. I wish there was a gallery in Katutura or a cultural village which brings people closer to the gallery and museum. That's Katutura in Namibia, which one of my favorite places.
In Namibia. And I think the question is what we should ask ourselves. What's stopping us to have that museum? It doesn't have to look like a big institution. This studio where I find myself in is a kind of a museum. If you come in, even in its scale, it doesn't have to be that big, or it can be even in its own capacity. That's how you get all these community-based projects and community-based museums. Nothing is stopping us from that.
Fantastic. Okay. I would like to take this opportunity to thank you very much, Charles Bhebhe, for joining us in a very, very interesting conversation. And it is my hope that your mom would also be able to come and visit the gallery.
Yes.
And I would also want to thank our listeners out there. Thank you very much for listening. And tomorrow we have another conversation where we are bringing museum director, Buto, our regional director from Bulawayo, and myself, including director of National Archive, who also come join us in a conversation. We want to discuss more about our role as museum professionals. So thank you very much. Same time tomorrow, 2:30, we'll be listening to these professionals as they discuss about what role they can play in a society post-COVID-19. So siyabonga, tatenda, asante sana. See you tomorrow. Tatenda.
Thank you for having me. Thank you. Thank you.